Hey guys! Part 8 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 Years Early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 34, Tsunade Retrieval, Turning Point. It figured. Naruto thought. The instant we get into town, the first thing Jiraiya does is go after some hooker. God, I'm glad that they didn't choose him to be the Hokage. As soon as they had gotten to Shakuba, which was an inn town that was close to Konoha and therefore had a large number of travelers from all over, the first thing the white-haired pervert had done had been to book them a room in one of the numerous inns and go chasing after the first hooker that smiled at him, leaving him to haul their stuff to their room. Trudging up the stairs with all their stuff had not been fun, especially considering how heavy Jiraiya's pack was, even though it was half filled with storage scrolls. He'd just been getting settled and had been going down for a nap when there was a knock at the door. When he answered it, he found himself looking up into a pair of Sharingan eyes. The next thing he knew, he was out in the hallway and there was this large blue guy talking about chopping off his legs. Crap. The damn bastard that he was almost 100% certain was Itachi had trapped him in a genjutsu without him noticing. Why was Itachi messing with him though? At least he thought it was Itachi. The man bore a striking resemblance to Itachi's entry in the bingo book. There was still the faint possibility that it was the bastard offspring of one of the Uchiha, despite the fact that he was wearing a Konoha Hittite which had been scratched to indicate that he wasn't affiliated with the village any longer. It wouldn't be the first time that someone had tried to cash in on the reputation of a relative they bore a striking resemblance to, however. As he prepared to flee since he knew he was no match for the likes of Uchiha Itachi, Sasuke came into the hallway. The instant he saw Itachi, the worried look on his face fell away and was replaced by an expression of utmost hatred. An almost impossibly fast time later, there was a Chidori in Sasuke's hand, and he was racing down the hall towards Itachi. The attack never connected, however. Itachi had grabbed Sasuke's arm and deflected the attack. As he prepared to fight in order to free his teammate from the other man, Itachi broke Sasuke's arm. Itachi's companion obviously saw him readying himself to attack, because the next thing he knew, there was a sword swinging in his direction. Before he could dodge, the sword was deflected by a sizable toad. When he turned around, it was to see Jiraiya holding the hooker who was now unconscious, and making a scene. Sasuke lay on the floor trying to recover. A broken arm wasn't the sort of thing that you got over after a few seconds, and got up fighting. The pain alone. The white-haired man who was called Jiraiya was talking about how putting a genjutsu on the unconscious woman he was holding in order to separate him from Naruto was a dirty trick, and how Naruto was that man's target. That man then said that capturing Naruto was the Akatsuki's #1 priority. Why? Why was capturing Naruto the Akatsuki's #1 priority? Who were the Akatsuki anyways? Oh. Of course. Duh. He knew the answer to one of the questions already. They didn't want Naruto per se, they wanted what he contained. They wanted it in order to set it loose on Konoha or any other village. With the power of the Kyuubi, they could hold entire nations hostage. Whoever they were, they stood to gain a great deal if they managed to capture Naruto. Naruto's companion Jiraiya spoke of dealing with both that man and his partner. In that moment, his hatred overcame his pain and his common sense. That man was his to kill. He'd sworn that he'd kill that man, and he wouldn't let anyone else do so. But out! He yelled as he managed to force himself to his feet. This is my battle! Oddly enough, Jiraiya complied with his demand. He'd sworn he'd kill Itachi. He'd spent every day of the last 5 years planning this. He dreamed of this at night when he wasn't having nightmares of the day his clan had died. This day had come at last. He raced towards that man, hoping to get a lucky shot, and since he was unable to do any jutsus due to his broken arm, he was kicked back. He raced forward again, and was kicked back once more. Naruto moved to help him, but Jiraiya held him back after he'd yelled that he didn't need any help. Despite the fact that he was getting the shit kicked out of him, this was still his fight, and he would see it through, to the bitter end if need be. In the end, he proved to still be far weaker than that man. That man easily defeated him, and beat him to near unconsciousness. As his vision was fading out, that man grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against the wall. "You are weak," that man said. "Do you know why you are weak? It's because you lack hatred." That man closed his eyes, and when he reopened them, they were different. He knew what was coming next. He'd experienced it once before, on the night his clan had died, and he'd been left alone. As the world started to warp around him, he found himself thinking that he hadn't lacked hatred. In fact, just about the only thing he'd felt since setting eyes on that man again had been hatred. It had been his hatred that had put him in this position, as it had overridden his common sense and his situational awareness. The instant that man had deflected his Chidori, he should have known that something like this would happen. As the sky turned red, he saw bits of his life flashing before his eyes, bits that weren't part of the genjutsu that looked like it was going to be a rehash of the massacre. It was strange what came to you near the end. He found himself remembering that boy Haku from Wave for some strange reason. "I believe that you become truly strong when you have someone precious to protect," said the exceedingly feminine boy who had woke him up. Who was right? The boy he had fought against in Wave, or that man who had proven strong enough to destroy his entire clan on a whim? Had he been weak because he lacked hatred, or because he wasn't fighting to protect someone else? It had been his desire not to lose anyone else to that man that had lent him the speed necessary to get here before that man could cart Naruto off. When he saw that man, however, all of that had gone out the window along with everything else. He'd refused all help, and as a result of his wild actions which that man had easily countered, he had ended up back here, back in this world where his family was being slaughtered, and there was nothing he could do but watch. He felt the terror he had felt that night, the first time he had seen this horrifying world where his family was killed around him. He saw every expression of horror, of betrayal, of determination as members of the family who hadn't picked up a weapon in years faced his brother in order to protect their families, and fell to that man's might, the might of the Mangekyo Sharingan, the cursed eyes you had to kill someone close to you to obtain. Even old man Masaichi, who could barely walk, had faced that man in a futile attempt at protecting his family. Old man Masaichi, who had shown more strength in that moment than at any other time he could remember. Old man Masaichi, who had run despite the arthritis and the bad leg. Old man Masaichi had become strong, but not strong enough. None of them had been strong enough. That man had caught them by surprise and used that moment of surprise, that moment of hesitation where the family couldn't believe that it was one of their own doing this to kill them. On more than one occasion early on, relatives drawn to the screams had come, seen Itachi, and died believing that he'd been there to help defeat the person who was doing this. They had been like fish in a barrel because one of the ones that should have been protecting them had chosen to slaughter them instead. He remembered that night, the night he too had felt that same betrayal as if it were last night. That night that his brother had revealed himself to be the monster who had slaughtered their family on a whim to test his ability. He hadn't done it out of hatred or malice, he'd done it because he was bored. He'd been strong, stronger than everyone else in the clan, and he'd proven it. There had been many bodies littering the ground of the Uchiha district to attest to that fact. He remembered the fear, the running, the screaming, the begging, the tears. That's right. That man had been crying. He'd run in fear, knowing he was no match for his brother, and at the last moment when it looked as if he were going to die, his Sharingan had activated. When his Sharingan had activated, he turned around and fought. It hadn't been enough, however. He'd been easily defeated and that man had fled. Strangely enough, there had been tears in his eyes as he did so. Why had he been crying though? There was nothing the sort of person who would kill his own family just to see how strong he was could be sorry for. That man had told him before he fled the night he'd killed the clan that in order to defeat him he should run and cling to life, hating him all the while, and not come back until he had eyes like his, the Mangekyo Sharingan. In order to get the Mangekyo Sharingan, he would have to kill someone close to him, someone he cared for, someone who cared for and trusted him. He would have to see the betrayal in that person's eyes as he or she fell to the ground dead the way the members of his clan had. He would have to become like that man. Was avenging the clan worth becoming another Itachi? A year ago, he would have unhesitatingly said yes. Heck, 6 months ago even. Hell, even a month ago. But now, as he stared at the betrayed faces of the members of his clan, he found himself hesitant. He wasn't sure if he should be hesitant though. If he survived today and got another chance, he would do it for them. He would become just like that man for them, but on a much smaller scale. Then what? Where would he go from there? Those who slay their comrades were on almost the same level as those who killed family. If he went through with it and killed someone to attain the Mangekyo Sharingan, he would never again be welcome in Konoha. He needed to be in Konoha to restart his clan though. He needed to be in Konoha to fill the compound with his descendants. He wouldn't be able to do that if he killed another of Konoha's citizens, especially if he did it for something like the Mangekyo Sharingan. Little brother, are you not watching? I don't think you are. I can fix that. Suddenly he was strapped to something so he couldn't flee even though there was nowhere he could run to in this place, and his eyes were forced open. The killing started again. And again. And again. And again. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, the world finally went dark. As soon as they were far enough away from the inn, Itachi split up from Kisame, found a bush, and emptied his stomach all over it. He hated doing that to his younger brother, but Sasuke needed to be strong. Sasuke needed to be stronger than him, because there was another who wouldn't hesitate to destroy him when he was gone, someone who was almost impossibly strong, someone whose power could put a Hokage to shame. He would do whatever it took to make Sasuke strong, even what he had just done. Sasuke was a rather single-minded person. He had been since he was a small infant. Once he had a goal, he stopped at nothing to achieve it. What he'd done to Sasuke during the Tsukuyomi was give him a fresh reminder of his goal, as time causes people to forget certain things such as the pain of loss. Sasuke would rise from this twice as determined, and become more than twice as strong because of it. He himself didn't have to like doing it, but it had to be done. In a way, forcing Sasuke to witness the massacre of the clan had been as much of a punishment for himself as it had been torture for Sasuke. He would never forget what he had done, but every once in a while he needed a reminder of what it had been that he'd sacrificed and why. Chapter 35, Tsunade Retrieval, Rasengan. Naruto felt doubly determined to retrieve the new Godame Hokage after Guy had informed him of Kakashi's current condition and made his request. It seemed that the man wasn't certain that the medics at the hospital would be able to help Sasuke and Kakashi, who had also fallen victim to Itachi's genjutsu. How the man had come to this conclusion, he didn't know. It was possible that the medics had said something along those lines while Kakashi was being examined at the hospital. Tsunade had made a name for herself outside her position as one of the Sannin as a top-flight medical ninja. It was said that none could match her skill in the medical field. Konoha needed her now. Most importantly, one of his precious people needed her now. He would bring her back, or he would die trying. Despite the somewhat dismal situation, Mato Guy was almost as cheerful as always. It was almost relieving to have just a little bit of normalcy in his life after what had happened recently, even if it was the dork that constantly spouted off about the flames of youth. He accepted the jumpsuit from Guy in the spirit it was given, as an acknowledgement of his existence and an offer of friendship. After seeing the look on the white-haired pervert's face when he received the rather tacky garment, he had almost been tempted to wear it throughout the entire trip. Almost. He would be saving it for when he ran out of clean laundry. That, and the moment it would be most embarrassing for the white-haired pervert to be seen with someone wearing such a thing. He and Jiraiya walked for a while until they reached another town. There was a festival of some sort going on when they reached the town, and Jiraiya sent him off to play. On the surface, this seemed rather irresponsible, but beneath that was something else. While the festival was going on, people from all over the region would be coming into town and widening the pool of information Jiraiya could gather. Sending him off would allow Jiraiya to go places that didn't allow children and meet with recalcitrant contacts who would not speak in his presence. Beneath that was the surface, however, and the possibility that Jiraiya would be off playing some adult games. There was no reason why the man couldn't do both while they were here, especially if the search for Tsunade was going to take as long as Jiraiya seemed to think it would. Jiraiya had rather greedily looked at his wallet, which contained his savings from several missions, and had actually tried taking it by bullshitting him about the 3 shinobi vices when he made the mistake of pulling it out of his pack in his presence. He managed to keep Gamachan and its contents safe, however. He'd already had the lecture on the 3 vices from Tetsuo sensei, and as he hadn't borrowed the money or stolen it from an ally, there was no problem there. It was his to spend however he pleased, and donating it to the white-haired pervert's hooker and booze fund didn't please. Jiraiya had then tossed him his own pack with some line about the toads being able to find it if he got lost, and turned him loose. Understanding the need for downtime, especially in stressful times, he took the opportunity he'd been given. While he was still sad about the old man and the state Konoha was in, he wasn't about to wallow in misery, as there was no point in doing so. He would follow the old saying, "Live while you can. You can die at any moment." That was part of his nindo, which included don't go back on your word unless there is absolutely no way you can fulfill the promise you made. Even though he did his best to live while he could, there were still days when he was overwhelmed. Today fortunately wasn't one of them, despite the fact that one of his teammates had been injured on his watch, and one of his precious people was badly injured. It was strange, really. He would have thought that if something like that had happened, he'd be having another one of his bad days, as Konohamaru called them. Perhaps he'd finally learned to deal with such things, as the others had said he would. Perhaps it was the distance between him and the situation making it seem less real to him, and therefore less painful. Guy had been the one to carry his injured teammate back this time. Perhaps it was the jovial atmosphere that was elevating his mood. Everyone here seemed happy, and nobody was giving him that look. That look was always worse on the bad days. The festival looked like a great deal of fun, and he planned to enjoy it the best he could. There were booths with everything from food to balloons, and a wide variety of games of luck and skill. There was even a puppet show that was detailing a ninja battle, and he could almost swear that he recognized the ANBU puppet. After stuffing himself with a little of everything, he started on the games. While he couldn't use ninjutsu, he could use his training some of the chakra control exercises he'd learned over the years to his benefit if he was discreet about it. As long as an off-duty or retired ninja didn't rat him out, he should be fine. Eventually, after he'd played every game available and watched one showing of the puppet show from the beginning, getting a good laugh over what was apparently a comedy rather than a fight, he went to the grilled squid stand and got something for Jiraiya, since he was almost certain that the man was getting his fill of booze rather than food, whether or not he was actually working like he was supposed to be doing. In the time he'd known the man, he'd struck him as a borderline alcoholic. Actually, he was almost certain that the man really was an alcoholic. It was a common enough affliction amongst shinobi that it barely rated commenting. Career shinobi like Jiraiya were much more likely to die in the field by the age of 35, rather than of, say, liver failure at the age of 50 or so. When he finally found Jiraiya, the man who had holed himself up in a bar somewhere had finally lost his patience with some wannabe mob boss who had been hassling him over a serving girl or something. Using a rather unusual jutsu that he didn't recognize, Jiraiya knocked the man into next week, destroying one of the balloon stands that littered the town in the process. "Hey Jiraiya, I bought you some squid," he said when the man finished apologizing and paid for the damages using the wallet that the wannabe mob boss had handed over. "Thanks," Jiraiya said as he stuck the adult-size fried squid on a stick in his mouth as he grabbed the bags of water balloons and balls that the stall owner had salvaged from the wreckage. As they turned to leave, he could have sworn he'd heard the wannabe mob boss say, "Oh God, he's training another one." They made their way out of town, and Jiraiya informed him that he would be spending the afternoon teaching him the jutsu he'd used on the wannabe mob boss, which was called the Rasengan. He watched as Jiraiya combined elements of the 2 basic chakra control exercises, tree climbing and water walking, to burst one of the water balloons that he'd carried away from the shattered stall. He watched this closely as he was certain that it could not be quite as easy as it appeared. Fortunately, he possessed some sort of talent or extreme good luck that had allowed him to get some of the higher-level jutsus in a much shorter amount of time than was expected, and that had been before the Kage Bunshin were taken into account. Kakashi had been amazed at the speed in which he'd learned the Kage Bunshin a couple years ago. The man hadn't expected him to get it in the week that he'd allotted for the task, and instead, he managed it by the morning of the 3rd day. He'd spent the rest of the week finding out exactly how many Kage-bunshin he could summon. He'd hit about 1,000 before he nearly killed himself with chakra exhaustion. With his Kage-bunshin, he could learn things that could take other individuals months or even years to learn in a much shorter period of time. He was almost certain that he'd gotten the wind element mastered, but he wasn't 100% so, as he hadn't been able to spend much time with another wind affinity. Asuma was rather busy with his own team, and he didn't know anyone else with that affinity, which was rather rare, especially in Fire Country where the main affinity amongst the ninja is fire. The reason why the main affinity for ninja in Fire Country is fire was the same reason the main affinity in wind is wind, and water is water, and so on, is because shinobi with that such affinities tended to group together in the countries that bore that name, creating a wider gene pool for that affinity. The reason this seems to have happened, according to the study he'd read, was that each country had an environment where a particular affinity would be slightly more useful. In Wind Country, a wind affinity could be useful in creating a wind to counter the wind of a sandstorm, creating a protective barrier that kept the flying sand from flaying you alive. In Earth Country, the Earth affinity could allow a user to create usable farming soil out of what had previously been a couple inches of dirt over about 100 feet of bedrock, or to burrow away from the hot sun. Fire Country had been mostly forest before it was torn up by centuries of war, and had become forest again after Konoha had been built. In such an environment, fire was useful for clearing out underbrush and controlled burns, as well as creating an instant campfire. All elements were of course useful in battle. "Can I use Kage-bunshin for this?" he asked Jiraiya. Tetsuo-sensei had agreed with Kakashi that as long as he was working alongside his clones, it would be fine to use them to learn new things. If he tried to run off to play again, Tetsuo-sensei would come down on him hard. The punishments Tetsuo-sensei could devise were things that he would do his best to avoid. "Sure, why not?" Jiraiya said as he settled himself against a nearby tree. "Thanks," he said as he summoned about 100 Kage-bunshin and set about trying to figure out how to pop a water balloon by rotating his chakra. Jiraiya looked slightly amazed by this for about half a second before he went back to his sake. Even though people already knew about the 1,000 Kage-bunshin incident, they were still quite surprised when he summoned more than about 10 Kage-bunshin at a time. Jiraiya's reaction was quite tame compared to some. Madogai sighed as he settled himself next to Kakashi's bed. Lee, who had been injured during the invasion, and Niji, who had been further injured when he went to retrieve his cousin who had been kidnapped during the invasion despite the fact that he wasn't up to full strength, were both already out of the hospital. Lee would be on leave for a while since he'd managed to break his leg in several places, nearly shattering his tibia. The medics, who had been swamped and rather pressed for time, had considered amputation, but fortunately for his student who had been unconscious at the time, he'd nixed that idea. He'd been out retrieving the Uchiha boy when Asuma's summon had come and informed him that they had taken Kakashi to the hospital, and that the medics hadn't been able to do more than put Kakashi in a bed and hope he woke up on his own. If Kakashi did wake up, his mental state would be uncertain. People who suffered through particularly traumatic genjutsu sometimes suffered breaks from reality, and would withdraw into their own little worlds to protect themselves. It might take years of intensive therapy and treatments with the Yamanaka the hospital had on hand to bring Kakashi back to the person he had been only hours ago. The Uchiha boy would most likely be in the same state, as he had suffered from the same technique. He hoped that Jiraiya and the Uzumaki boy would bring Tsunade-sama soon. The longer this continued, the worse the prognosis would become. Tsunade was a legendary medic, and it was said that she could cure almost any ailment under the sun. That wouldn't do Kakashi and his pupil any good, however, if there was nothing left to cure. While he waited for Tsunade to come, he would have to hold to the two things that had gotten him through every difficult situation so far: patience, and the faith that things would improve. "Kakashi, you better get well. If you don't, I don't know what I'll do," he said. "Despite that annoyingly hip attitude, you've always had my back, and I should have had yours." Chapter 36, Tsunade Retrieval, Finding Tsunade. It had taken Naruto a day and a half to figure out how to spin the water in the water balloon in order to get the balloon to burst the way Jiraiya had. One of the clones had discovered it almost accidentally. What had happened was that he had tried spinning the water one way, and then tried spinning the water another way. The clone had rapidly switched from one direction to another and noticed a peculiar disruption. When he rapidly switched back and forth again and got the same disruption, he tried rapidly changing directions. Eventually, the balloon burst. Apparently the trick was to either swirl his chakra about in different directions all at once or to change directions so rapidly that it seemed that he was doing so. He would try both when he did the second step which Jiraiya had described. It took him nearly a week to master the second step, and during that week, Jiraiya spent his days interviewing several contacts as well as a bunch of random travelers who had come to the town for the 2-week-long festival, and spent his evenings drinking and getting serviced by hookers. He was starting to doubt that Jiraiya had ever been with a woman that he hadn't paid for. Eventually, after hours and hours of hard work, one of his clones had managed to burst the rubber ball that he'd been given. A few hours later, he was able to consistently replicate that feat. Jiraiya then introduced him to the third phase of the jutsu, the one that would complete the Rasengan. It would take a great deal of work, but he would get it eventually, and long before the 3 years it had taken the yondaime to create the jutsu had passed. It always took much longer for someone to create a jutsu due to all of the trial and error involved than it did to learn one that had already been created. All of the pain he had undergone learning this jutsu, and all of the kage bunshin that had been sacrificed would be worth it in the end. Jiraiya sighed. While he knew more about the Akatsuki and Oto's current movements thanks to several contacts, he'd gotten absolutely zilch on the Tsunade front. Tsunade had always been good at hiding. The information he'd gained on the Akatsuki was little more than garbage. Apparently all that his contacts knew was that several of the other hidden villages had hired the Akatsuki to do the sort of wet work that Danzo's little organization did for Konoha. On the Orochimaru front, it seemed like his former teammate had holed up in his little village and was licking his wounds. That was another day wasted. He would get in a few hours of downtime before he wandered off to bed and checked on Naruto's progress again in the morning. That boy truly was his father's child, as well as his mother's. He seemed to be an almost even blend of both of his parents, in fact. He had his mother's bone structure and his father's coloring. He had a personality that was a mix of both that of his father and his mother, and possessed his mother's somewhat charming verbal tic, though he sometimes ended his sentences with tabeo, rather than the tabane his mother had used. Someone had obviously worked with Naruto on that verbal tic since it showed up most often when he wasn't paying attention, or was rather excited. Teaching Naruto was a somewhat enjoyable experience, and he could see why both little Kakashi and Shimura Tetsuo had been reluctant to let him go. The boy learned a great deal with minimal instruction, had incredible leaps of intuition that left you scratching your head as you raced to keep up, learned at an incredibly fast pace, and would still be at it long after another person would have given up and wandered off to do something else. He couldn't wait until he was able to instruct Naruto full-time rather than split his attention between two tasks. He would branch out his search to other nearby towns in the morning. Somebody had to know something about where Tsunade was located. Tsunade didn't really care about the money that flowed away like water. She knew she wouldn't win. She never won. Not in life, or in gambling. The times it did seem that she had won at one or the other were just the universe setting her up for an even greater disaster. She'd learned that long ago. Gambling took her mind off of them. She couldn't think their names. If she did, she would see their faces again, see their faces as they had been both in life and in death. Damn. It was too late. She was remembering them again, but then again, she never forgot. They had hung at the edges of her mind day in and day out for decades. As far as she was concerned, it was a good thing that Shizen had her mother's hair, unlike her and Dan's cousins. Seeing that blue-haired family running about happy and healthy without Dan there had been much too painful. Unlike some of his relatives from his mother's side of the family who had been known to make off with anything that wasn't nailed down, Dan hadn't been all that much of a thief, even though he had stolen her heart. He had then carried it away with him into death the day he had died on that battlefield. Nawaki had been a surprise that had come long after her parents had lost hope and begun to think that Tsunade would be an only child. Her mother had had a hard time conceiving her, and had come to believe that her inability to have any more children had been related to the fact that she had been born after the Kyuubi had been sealed away within her mother. Her parents had married at a rather young age after meeting and falling in love during a rather difficult mission, and she had been born after almost 3 years of miscarriages. When her mother had announced that she was pregnant, the whole family had been cautiously optimistic. The first trimester passed without incident, and they breathed a collective sigh of relief. The second trimester passed, and the child was still there. Then came the third trimester and Nawaki's extremely early arrival. Everyone had said that it had been a miracle that Nawaki had survived. Nawaki had been the family miracle child who had been loved and doted upon by everyone. As he grew, it had become more and more obvious that the boy was more like his Uzumaki cousins rather than his Senju relatives. He had been adventurous, wild, bold, passionate, and determined. When Nawaki had been placed on a genin team under her former teammate Orochimaru, she had been certain that her teammate would keep her brother safe. Nawaki's death had marked the beginning of the end for the Sannin. Orochimaru had not been able to deal with death and loss all that well, and he had lost a great deal during the Second Shinobi War as well as the Third. It had more than likely been these losses that had driven Orochimaru to hole himself away in his lab studying things, and start forgetting that people were actually people, not test subjects. After one has been given leave to experiment on the enemy however one pleased, it was only a short jump to experimenting on others, such as fellow villagers. She herself had almost made that leap a few times and could understand what had driven Orochimaru to do so. She had heard the reports that Konoha had been invaded and the Sandaime killed, but as she hadn't listened to the original broadcast, she had taken them with a grain of salt. Rumor had Konoha in every state from entirely intact minus some cosmetic damage to completely destroyed with only a few survivors wandering through the rubble. She'd seen a couple Konoha shinobi out on missions, so she knew that the village hadn't been destroyed, as it was apparently still open for business. The shinobi she'd seen looked rather stressed and somewhat overworked however, meaning that the village was short-staffed at the moment. How short-staffed however, she couldn't tell. It wasn't her concern however. She had left Konoha and its problems behind long ago after she had lost everything. She wouldn't let them trail behind her reminding her of her losses wherever she went now. She had more than enough reminders already. Orochimaru hated this. It had nearly been a month since his former sensei had called upon the Shinigami and sealed his arms away. If it had merely been that he couldn't use his arms, he wouldn't be nearly as frustrated as he was. Along with a lack of mobility in his arms though, there was excruciating pain. He didn't like pain, and he didn't like people seeing him when he was weak. It had been for those two reasons that he'd killed any number of Kabuto's assistants who had been assigned to help him. The only reason he was putting up with this was because he was waiting for Sasuke. He would have had the boy kidnapped earlier and brought to him, but the child had been attacked by Itachi and by all accounts was laying in a coma, and therefore useless for his purposes. Itachi was yet another thorn in his side. He didn't want to throw this body away just yet if there was a chance that it could be salvaged. Changing bodies was rather difficult and left him weakened for a time. For probably the first time, he was glad that he'd selected a female body this time as he was still experimenting with the transfer process. If he had been in a male body, going to the bathroom would be far more difficult and rather unpleasant, especially considering what it would take to go to the bathroom without assistance. He knew this, because when he'd gained his ability to extend his tongue incredible distances, he'd done what anyone would have done with such an ability, and experimented. He was able to shut out his sense of taste when he had to, considering the fact that he used his tongue to grab a wide variety of objects, including people, but still, doing that was unhygienic as far as he was concerned. He was in a particularly bad mood today since the pain was worse than normal, and Kabuto's current assistant was an unrepentant ass-kisser that Kabuto probably sent to get out of the way permanently. He wasn't really in the mood to take the medicine he'd been given however, since it had an awful flavor that he couldn't entirely shut out, a horribly bitter aftertaste that took enough water to leave him feeling bloated to get rid of, and the texture was downright nasty. He had a feeling that Kabuto did this to the medicines he made to prevent malingering, and to keep people from bothering him since they were too afraid to approach him for treatment. After he'd killed Kabuto's nth assistant, Kabuto finally showed up to check on him and give him the good news. Tsunade had been found. He was going to get his arms fixed. As soon as he got his arms fixed, he could go and get Sasuke fixed. As soon as Sasuke was fixed, he was going to put his curse seal on the boy and prepare him for transfer. Everything was looking up. Kabuto helped him dress, tying all of the fiddly bits that he couldn't deal with using his tongue, and they set out from his lair after Kabuto cleaned up the mess that had once been his assistant, since he didn't want to come back to find it stinking up the place, since his other subordinates were too afraid to enter his room unless ordered, and probably wouldn't do so even if it was to remove a rotting corpse. All too soon, they were on the road, traveling at an excruciatingly slow pace since he didn't want to trip and land flat on his face. He wasn't in the mood to go licking the ground in order to get up. They would reach Tsunade though. They would reach Tsunade, and he would use his ace in the hole to get his arms fixed. He knew Tsunade's weaknesses, all of them, and he wasn't above using each and every last one to get what he wanted. Jiraiya had been asking around a bar that was the local watering hole for gamblers when he finally struck pay dirt. His long-stalled search for Tsunade had finally grown hot. The legendary sitting duck had lost big time, and headed out of the town he was asking in. Fortunately, one of the other gamblers had heard her intended location. After thanking the man who really shouldn't be drinking in the mid-afternoon, not that he was really one to talk, he raced out to where he'd left Naruto. The boy was in the clearing he'd left him in, destroying trees as he fine-tuned his Rasengan. The boy had almost fully mastered in a single month a jutsu that had taken him more than 3 months to learn. "You truly are your fair, mother's son," he told the boy as he examined the tree that had just been trashed when he'd entered the clearing. "You'll have to finish working on this on the road. I've found a lead on Tsunade, and we have to leave now before she goes on the move and vanishes again." The somewhat tired-looking boy perked up at this, and started looking excited. He could tell that the month of relative inactivity had been wearing on him. Naruto was hyperactive and had a great deal of energy, just like his mother had at that age. It had taken her years to calm down, and even then she hadn't calmed down entirely. He had considered taking Kushina on as a student at one point, as she had reminded him a bit of himself when he was younger, but his sensei had forbidden it. For one, Kushina was the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, and he hadn't wanted her out in the open where she would be vulnerable for another abduction attempt like the one Kyumo had made around the time he made his request. 2. Kushina was a girl, and he was well known far and wide as a pervert, even then before he'd written his famous Ika novels. Taking her on as a student could seriously damage his reputation even if nothing happened. Considering all of the things that had been said after Orochimaru had run off with Enko, he had to concede that point. Having Naruto as his student was interesting. It was like having Minato and Kushina all rolled into one package. He found himself wondering exactly what the future would bring, as the boy was as stubborn as his father, as unpredictable as his mother, and as talented as both of them had been at that age. Now, however, he would have to concentrate on what he was going to say to persuade Tsunade to return to a village she had sworn to never return to, and to take a job she never wanted. Chapter 37, Tsunade Retrieval, Deals and Refusals. Momochi Zabuza carefully schooled his expression so his darling wife wouldn't see his disgust and misinterpret it. He hated vomit. Looking at it made him want to puke, and that was just what his wife was doing at the moment. As was his husbandly duty in this instance, he was holding the Mizuki's hair back away from the toilet. He just wished that there wasn't so much of it. The woman's hair was extremely thick and nearly ankle length, and bits of it kept trying to escape and head for the toilet. He hoped it was all worth it in the end. One day, he would have an heir to carry on the Momochi family name, but until then, he would have to put up with vomit, odd cravings, and eventually a small creature that screamed for food and attention at all hours, crapped itself, and did God only knew what else. Orochimaru hadn't particularly cared that the castle that had been destroyed by the serpent that Kabuto had summoned for him had been listed as a cultural heritage site, or that it had been more than 500 years old. He'd destroyed things that were far older, things that were far more valuable, and things that were both before in times of war and times that should have been of peace. What Orochimaru cared about was that he was close to his goal, and that the pain and the sickness that had come with his sensei's final curse would finally end. He would have to play this carefully, and not show any more than his most obvious weakness while prodding at Tsunade's major one. A proper entrance was often half the battle, and he just made a majorly impressive one that was sure to put his former teammate slightly off guard. Now to push her completely off center. During the initial negotiations, things went pretty much how he figured they would go. Tsunade was naturally slightly pissed over the death of their sensei, and told him as much. He himself still felt a twinge of something, but it was mostly buried under his hatred of the old man who had taken his arms with him into death. There had naturally been a squabble between his apprentice and Tsunade's. They had appeared to be even in that small bout, but he knew that Kabuto was the stronger of the two, the stronger and wilier of the two. Tsunade tried her best to bluff her way out of the situation with a small show of power, but he knew the woman far too well to fall for it. He made his offer, and then he left. As he had suspected, Tsunade hadn't gotten over her hemophobia, but considering the source of it, it was likely that she never would. He had given Tsunade a week to decide, a week to stew over things. She knew that Tsunade would be spending that week suffering, as she would be able to do nothing other than think of those she lost, those she failed, those she had come to believe she had killed by handing over her grandfather's necklace. Tsunade would either agree to the deal, or she would try to kill him. Knowing Tsunade, he knew that it would be a very close decision for her, even though he planned on turning around and destroying Konoha as soon as his arms were repaired, and the losses amongst his forces compensated for. Tsunade had come to despise the village that she had believed had taken the lives of the ones she loved, the village that her brother and her lover had both sworn to rule over as Hokage one day. He liked both Nawaki and Dan in his own way. Nawaki had been on his first genin team, a team he hadn't been certain that he was ready for but had taken anyways since it was necessary for the war effort. Nawaki was brave, bold, and far too easily excitable for his own good. It had cost the boy his life. Had Nawaki not run ahead of the team that day, and survived, there was a small possibility that he would have been the one running around the village bragging about the fact that his student had become Hokage rather than Jiraiya. That would have been after he'd grown tired of being Hokage himself, of course. Had Dan survived, there was a good chance that he would have been the Yondaime instead of Minato. Both were extremely talented men who had loved their village. But Dan had been slightly more loved by the populace who had some reservations about Minato's powers and abilities up until his death had wiped out every bad thing the citizens of Konoha had felt about him. The position should have been his with either Dan or Minato having even been considered, but that was neither here nor there. In a week's time, he would learn Tsunade's answer, and be able to plan accordingly. While he did hope she would accept, and do anything it took to get Dan and Nawaki back again as she had once said she would as she cried over their graves, he wasn't banking on it. If worse came to worse, he could take more drastic measures to get his former teammate to cooperate. Though Tsunade didn't seem to realize it, there was still someone in her life, someone she would miss. The fact that that little assistant of hers was one of Dan's blood relatives was just icing on the cake as far as he was concerned. It would make the loss all the more traumatizing for his former teammate. Sakura sighed as she replaced the dead flower in the vase by Sasuke's bed with a fresh one again. She wished that there was something she could do for her teammate, but the only thing she could do was what the medics were doing already, sitting, waiting, and hoping that Sasuke would still be Sasuke when he woke up. Though she had begun to research medical jutsu on her own, she didn't have the knowledge necessary to heal her teammate. She had been coming here every day when she wasn't on missions or tending to other duties. One day, Sasuke would wake up, and she'd be there to see it, be there to see for herself whether or not her teammate was alright, or would be in the future. She had visited Kakashi sensei earlier like she usually did. He was in much the same condition as Sasuke. Guy was there like he always was when he wasn't training or on missions. Lee was there as well like a shadow or a miniature clone. Lee was currently on leave while his leg healed. From what she'd heard, a building or something had fallen on him while he had been protecting Konoha during the invasion. Lee occasionally came to check on Sasuke as well, but mostly it was to see how she was holding up rather than out of sympathy for her teammate's condition. Niji had shown up as well at one point, but that had been to ask where Naruto had gone off to. She couldn't tell him beyond the fact that he'd gone on some sort of mission, and had yet to return despite the fact that it had been a month. Niji had some small burn scars across his arms, and moved with a slight limp as a result of the beating he had gotten when he had gone to rescue his cousin despite having been shocked and burned a short while before. During the invasion, a couple of Kumo ninja had taken the opportunity to kidnap Hinata, who was still recovering from the injuries she'd sustained. Niji and Kiba had gone out to retrieve her since nobody else could be spared at the time. The two of them had nearly died before Hyuga Hayashi and his father were finally able to reach them and rescue all three of them. Ino had visited on several occasions, and instead of fighting as usual, they had sat and talked of old times as they waited for signs that Sasuke was regaining consciousness. Their friendship may never become what it had been before she'd thrown it away over Sasuke, who couldn't have cared less about her at that point, but it was on the mend. It seemed to be the only good thing that had come out of this entire disaster. Jiraiya had gone to every gambling hall in Tanzaku and failed to find Tsunade. At each establishment, he'd half expected to see his former teammate drunkenly throwing money and chips down for the dealer or her fellow gamblers to rake in. No Tsunade, however. There were any number of people who had seen and taken the money of the legendary sitting duck, but no one seemed to know where she was at the moment, even when he'd plunked down money for the information. His most recent lead had been a pachinko parlor where Tsunade had actually won, oddly enough. That could be a very bad sign, however, as whenever Tsunade won at gambling, something terrible always followed. After a while he had decided to find a bit of high ground and search for his teammate with the telescope he usually used for research. Tanzaku had a rather tall and impressive castle that was set above the town, which would serve his purposes nicely. Jiraiya? Naruto asked when he informed the boy of their new destination. Where's the castle? He blinked, and turned, before noticing the massive and rather new-looking pile of rubble where the castle should be. He had known that he was preoccupied over the coming reunion between himself and Tsunade after more than a decade of being apart, and with his argument to persuade her to take an unwanted job off his hands, but to be so unobservant as to not even notice that one of the major local landmarks was missing entirely? As he made his way up the hill to survey the damage, someone came running down yelling something about a giant snake. Crap. Orochimaru had found her first. He should have known, considering the fact that death and destruction on a massive scale were more Orochimaru's speed. From the lack of further damage in the surrounding area, barring what looked like one of Tsunade's infamous wall punches, he was guessing that there hadn't been a battle, or that it hadn't been a long one. Both Orochimaru and Tsunade were long gone from the area, and it was more than likely that Tsunade had fled Tanzaku as well. Now that he had a trail to pick up, it shouldn't take him another month to find her again. He had always been better at finding things than Orochimaru was. Orochimaru could lose his house keys by setting them on his dresser. He would do a sweep of Tanzaku just in case, as it was possible that Tsunade had gone to ground, hoping that Orochimaru would think she'd fled and go searching for her elsewhere. Naruto sighed. He was tired, and his feet hurt. He could walk or run for far longer than a day if he really had to, but it still wasn't all that pleasant. Eventually, Jiraiya had called a halt to their search for Tsunade, who had most likely survived her encounter with Orochimaru, as there weren't any bodies or blood in the area surrounding the shattered wall near the ruins of the castle, which were more than likely filled with dead tourists. It was possible that Tsunade had been one of the tourists that had been inside the landmark at the time the castle was destroyed, but Jiraiya said that that was highly unlikely since the wall had appeared to have been her work rather than Orochimaru's. They walked into a pub for dinner. He was half expecting the owner to shoo him out as they did so. It was pretty much only in Konoha and probably the other ninja villages that children didn't get shooed out of the bars. In Konoha, if you had a Hittite, you could pretty much go anywhere that wasn't restricted to authorized personnel only. While genin weren't allowed alcohol, they were allowed to sit with their chunin friends who were, and if the chunin happened to slip their friend a drink, well, it didn't usually get commented on. As luck, or perhaps Jiraiya's chakra sensing abilities when it came to teammates and others who had been close to him would have it, Tsunade happened to be in the bar Jiraiya had selected in the process of getting completely wasted. They moved to sit with her, and Jiraiya ordered a rather nice meal for all of them. He decided to use the meal to get a better understanding of his new Hokage, who had once been one of the old man's students, the same as Jiraiya and Orochimaru. As he studied his new Hokage, he noticed that he could see a bit of Senju Hashirama about her, especially around the nose and the mouth, though she bore a stronger resemblance to her maternal grandmother Uzumaki Mido. She had her father's hair color, however. She seemed supremely unhappy, and he had a feeling that it had something to do with her encounter with Orochimaru, which she hadn't really seemed to want to talk about. Throughout the meal, Jiraiya kept serving Tsunade drinks, even though she didn't need any more, and would quite likely end up with alcohol poisoning if she continued to drink at the rate she had been during the meal and before it, if the number of empty bottles in front of her were any indication. Oddly enough, it seemed as if Jiraiya were bracing himself for something as the meal progressed. After a while, when Jiraiya and Tsunade were done eating, Tsunade asked what Jiraiya wanted with her, and he informed her. She did not appear to be pleased with the news. If it had been him, he would have been jumping around in joy, not shuffling a deck of cards for a game with Jiraiya and almost calmly discussing the old man's death, as if she hadn't really cared either way. As Tsunade and Jiraiya sat there almost calmly playing cards, Jiraiya asked her what her answer to the village's request that she become Hokage would be. He knew that people said things they didn't mean when they were drunk, but insulting all 4 of the previous Hokages and the village and saying the mean things she had said about the Yondaime and the old man? Had he still been as wild as he had been when he'd first become a genin, he probably would have tried to beat Tsunade up regardless of the consequences. As it was, "This bitch is going to be Hokage?" he asked while she was talking about the job being nothing but trouble. "You want someone like her in charge of the village?" The only good I see coming out of that would be the fact that the villagers would all be cheering for some reason other than feeling that they were obligated to do so when I get named Hokage. "You? Hokage? Ha!" Tsunade said as she grabbed her drink. "I swore I'd become Hokage one day, and that's one promise that only death will make me go back on," he said as he clenched his fists under the table. It would be supremely stupid to attack one of the Sannin, especially the one who had been named Hokage, even though she hadn't earned that title. While she had refused for now, they hadn't spent an entire month searching for the woman only to go home empty-handed, and he knew that Jiraiya wouldn't leave it at that. He couldn't. If he did, that would mean the only other viable option for the position of Hokage besides Tsunade was Jiraiya, and he wasn't sure which of them would be worse. Don't get him wrong, he liked Jiraiya, and the man had been added to his list of precious people, but he wasn't the sort of leader Konoha needed now, or ever for that matter. The man was a drunken pervert who frittered almost all of his available cash away on women and booze and would have taken his money to spend on them as well if he ever gave him the opportunity. Jiraiya was like Satoshi, you had to watch your stuff around him, other than that, he was fine. He just wasn't what Konoha needed, especially considering the state the village was currently in. Tsunade gave him a strange look before spending the rest of the evening quietly drinking until she passed out. Chapter 38 Tsunade Retrieval, Tsunade's Choice. Tsunade had woken up the morning after her meeting with Jiraiya with a massive hangover. She had drank enough to pass out, but she hadn't drank enough to forget yesterday, however. She had the feeling that it would take enough alcohol to kill her to do that. She should have known her day would go to hell like it had when she'd won big time at the pachinko parlor. Orochimaru had given her an offer that she wasn't certain she could refuse yesterday afternoon. If she had a Rio for the number of times she had wished that she could have Dan and Nawaki back, she would be able to pay back all of her debts tenfold. Orochimaru had offered to bring them back to her. All she would have to do would be to heal his arms, which was simple enough. There was a catch to this, though. There always was a catch. First of all, if she accepted the offer and healed the arms of her teammate, the man who had betrayed Konoha, the man who had killed their sensei, he would turn around and destroy the village she had left forever along with Dan's niece more than a decade ago. Secondly, in order to get Dan and Nawaki back, she would have to sacrifice the lives of 2 other people. While she was willing to sacrifice a couple of strangers, maybe a couple of criminals who didn't deserve to live, she had a feeling that Dan and Nawaki wouldn't be happy that she had done so in order to bring them back. They would be even more unhappy if they discovered that she had betrayed the village that they had sacrificed their lives for by helping the man who had murdered the Hokage and swore to destroy Konoha. She wanted them back so badly, though, and having them gone hurt so much. To top off her day from hell, Jiraiya showed up with Kushina and Minato's brat, and told her that Konoha wanted her to be the Godame Hokage. She never wanted to be Hokage. That had been Nawaki and Dan's dream. That had been the dream that both of them had died for. That had been the position that had taken her grandfather, her great-uncle, her sensei, and Jiraiya's student. She has the feeling that Jiraiya won't leave her alone until she says yes and follows him back to the village that she'd sworn never to return to, even though she would be the worst Hokage in the history of Konoha. Minato's son, who greatly resembled Kushina, and Nawaki, who had taken after their Uzumaki relatives, told her as much. Like Minato, who had died in office, Kushina, who had sacrificed herself to reseal the Kyuubi, Nawaki, who had died in the field, and Dan, who had died right in front of her, little Naruto's dream was to become Hokage. Like little Nawaki, he too had sworn not to go back on his word. Why couldn't Jiraiya have left her alone, left her to a life where she didn't tally up all of the precious people she had lost instead of just the two most painful losses, left her to a life where she had pretty much forgotten the existence of her young cousin who had reminded her far too much of Nawaki just as her son was now? She strongly suspected that Jiraiya knew exactly how much it hurt to see that boy, and that had been why he had brought him along. Just looking at that boy who looked like Nawaki, but who had Dan's barely restrained temper, was painful. That boy in whom Kushina's fire flashed from Minato's eyes. Making her decision on whether or not she should accept Orochimaru's offer was difficult enough without Jiraiya showing up with a living reminder of the people she lost. Heck, that kid even had her mother's whisker marks that had been the sign of a child who had been born to the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. On the one hand, Nawaki and Dan would be disappointed in her if she betrayed Konoha by helping an enemy. On the other, however, they didn't need to ever know what she had done, especially if she kept them away from Konoha, or rather the crater Orochimaru was going to turn Konoha into forever. She would be glad to have them back, even if they were upset with her. This decision shouldn't be so hard. She knew what right was, and she knew what had been in the oaths she had taken as a genin. She knew what her grandfather, whom she didn't really remember since he died when she was a toddler, would say. She knew what her great-uncle, who had died while she was still small, would say. She knew what her sensei would say. She knew what Jiraiya's little apprentice would say. She knew what Nawaki and Kushina would say loudly and frequently. But still, she did her best to avoid Jiraiya and the boy for the next couple of days. Jiraiya knew something was up beyond her reluctance to become Hokage. He always could read her like an open book. After 2 days, her former teammate caught up with her and told her that he would personally kill her if she betrayed Konoha. She could tell that it killed the man to tell her this. Jiraiya had always loved her, as a friend and as a teammate. Though he still held out the vague hope that they could become something more, he didn't hold it out that far. She, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru had been the closest knit of genin teams for their generation, 3 early academy graduates who had been handpicked to be trained by the Sandaime Hokage himself. The 3 of them had meteorically risen through the ranks, sticking together as they did so. They had been each other's closest friends for decades, even when circumstances and war tried to rip them apart. Konoha had never seen the likes of them again, though there was one other team that had come close, before it had been torn apart by the Third Shinobi War. That team had been Team Minato, which had been trained by the future Yondaime Hokage. There had been the somewhat aloof and extremely talented orphan who had little to no idea as to how to connect with others. There had been the talented and tough medical specialist, and there had been the determined goof who had held the 3 together. She knew that Jiraiya had been considering taking on the little goofball Obito as an apprentice before the boy had died. It was a real pity that had happened. She liked Obito. He'd been so much like Nawaki. When the team had split at the end of the Third Shinobi War, and Orochimaru had fled, it had hurt almost as much as losing Nawaki and Dan had. It had been then that she had taken Shizen and left Konoha, which no longer held anything for her but painful reminders of what had been, and what could have been. She could tell that the split and Orochimaru's betrayal had hurt Jiraiya greatly as well. Jiraiya too had left Konoha upon the death of his student, and had taken to drinking far more heavily than he should, much as she did. Neither of them had been able to bring themselves to kill Orochimaru in the near decade and a half since he had been discovered to be a monster. Even though he was a traitor, he was still a teammate, and neither of them had been willing to get his blood on their hands. Now, however, Jiraiya had told her that if she too betrayed Konoha, she wouldn't survive the betrayal, and he had meant it. Though following through would more than likely kill him, Jiraiya had meant it. All too soon, the week was almost up, and Shizen was demanding that she not go. She did the only thing she could do at that point, and made sure that Shizen didn't follow her the next day. There was a good chance that things would go wrong, and despite what she chose, she didn't want Shizen to get caught in the crossfire. Shizen was all she had now, and she didn't want Dan's niece dying for her as well. Jiraiya hadn't been having a good week. He had come to a decision that he knew would kill him earlier that week after he'd begun to suspect another of his teammates of treason. When he'd first suspected Orochimaru, he hadn't wanted to believe it, and he didn't want to believe it now despite the very obvious signs Tsunade was displaying. Ironic really, the person who had been nominated as Godame Hokage of Konoha being willing to betray the village the way he had a more than sneaking suspicion that Tsunade was. He'd known that Tsunade would originally reject the position of Hokage, but he had been certain that he would find a way to get her to come around, even if he had to invoke the names of Dan and Nawaki. He knew that Tsunade would see a great deal of Nawaki in Naruto as well as little Minato and Kushina. Kushina and Tsunade had been as thick as thieves at one point. Now, he wasn't too sure. Perhaps it would have been better if he had accepted the position of Hokage and not been forced to face the possibility that Tsunade too could be a traitor to Konoha. Hearing her speak as if she didn't care that their sensei was dead had been painful. Hearing her call the man who had practically raised them a fool for giving his life for the village hurt even worse. Tsunade had met with Orochimaru before he had found her, and something had happened. Something that she wasn't willing to share. Between him and Orochimaru, Tsunade had always been a bit closer to Orochimaru. When they were small, Tsunade had had a massive crush on the other boy, and he wasn't entirely certain that those feelings were gone. Even though Orochimaru was a traitor, he was one of the few people Tsunade had left, one of the few people they both had left. They had, all three of them, been closer than blood. That wasn't exactly something you threw away, even if one of the people closest to you hurt you as badly as Orochimaru had. After a week of getting the runaround from Tsunade, he decided that it would be the best idea to interrogate Shizen while Tsunade was away. Over the past week, he'd been dropping hints that he knew something was going on and that Orochimaru was involved, but Shizen had been silent, remaining loyal to Tsunade. She had looked even more stressed with each passing day, however. He had a feeling that she might finally break down and spill everything today. If not today, then tomorrow maybe. He headed to Tsunade and Shizen's room with Naruto trailing behind. When he got there, it was to find Shizen on the floor unconscious. She was quickly revived, and turned out not to be very seriously injured, however. She had been taken down by a medical technique of some sort. "Oh God! We have to go, we have to stop her," Shizen said after she was fully awake and had been given the date and time. "What is it we have to stop?" he asked as he followed Shizen out the window. Orochimaru offered to revive Dan and Nawaki if Tsunade fixed his arms for him. He gave her a week to decide, and that week is up now. I hadn't thought she would seriously consider the offer, but she did. I had begged Tsunade not to go, but she went anyway, Shizen said as they raced through the trees towards what was presumably the meeting point. "Oh damn," he said. He had hoped and prayed that it wouldn't come to this. "Who was Dan?" Naruto asked, apparently having known who Nawaki was from his research on Tsunade, which didn't seem to have been completed. He had almost sent the boy away, but they would need all of the help they could get, especially since he had no idea how many people Orochimaru would bring with him. He prayed that the boy wouldn't get killed in the coming battle. Dan was Tsunade's boyfriend. He died early on in the Third Shinobi War. Tsunade was there trying to heal him when it happened, he replied. "Oh," Naruto said as they continued towards the place where Tsunade and Orochimaru would meet. All he could think as they raced towards the coming battle was, oh God, not both of them. He'd lost his sensei, and now he'd lost both of his teammates forever. After the invasion, he had finally acknowledged the fact that he would have to kill his former friend the instant the opportunity presented itself. Now, he would have to kill Tsunade as well, since she too had turned traitor to Konoha. The day that the other two Sannin were dead would be the day he too died. The three of them would be together in death, much the way they had once been in life. "I'm sorry, Naruto," he said. "Why?" Naruto asked. "I'll tell you later," he replied. The boy didn't need the knowledge of what he planned to do clouding his concentration during the coming battle. The time she had dreaded all week had come, and Orochimaru was standing in front of her. "Have you made your decision?" Orochimaru asked. "Yes," she replied. "I'm sorry, Dan, Nawaki, I'll be seeing you soon." She gathered her chakra into her hands. That's it for part 8. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.